You learned in this module how you can use Entity Framework to add and delete friends in the Friend Organizer application. You have also seen a little trick to trigger the validation by setting the friend's first name property to an empty string when a new friend has been created. You have also learned how you can hide and display the friend detail view by using an implicit data template and the content control. In the next module, we will extend the Friend Organizer application by introducing a programming language entity, and a friend will get a favorite programming language. Welcome to the module Working with Lookups. My name is Thomas Claudius Huber. In this module, I will show you how you can display a list of items to the user so that he can select a single item from that list. Displaying such a list where a user can select a single item is called a lookup. To explain you a bit more detailed what we do in this module, let me show you the module outline. In this module, we will create a programming language entity, and then we will add a favorite language ID property to the friend entity. For these entities, we will create a DB migration, so the friend table in the database will have a foreign key to the programming language table. This means that the user can select a favorite language for a friend in the user interface. After we have created the programming language entity and migrated the database, we will extend the lookup data service. We will use the lookup data service in the friend detail view model to load programming language entities. When the friend detail view model has a list of programming languages, we can add a combo box to the friend detail view so that the user can select a favorite programming language for a friend. Now let's start and let's create the programming language entity. In this demonstration, we will create the programming language entity in the Friend Organizer application, and we will also add a database migration with Entity Framework code first. Let's switch to Visual Studio. The friend entity of the Friend Organizer application is in this Friend Organizer model project. So let's also add the new entity programming language to that model project. I right-click and I say Add Class. We want to add a class that we call programming language. I make the class public and I add a property of type int for the ID. I also add another property of type string and I call it name. A programming language has a name. This property is required and it should have a string length of 50. I don't know a programming language where the name is longer than 50, maybe that exists, but in our application it's not possible to enter such one. Now let me also remove the unnecessary usings here. Our little programming language entity is already done. We will just have the ID as a primary key and the programming language has a name. Now let's open up the friend model. On the friend entity, I add a property of type nullable int and I call it favorite language ID. I also add a property of type programming language and I call it favorite language. So this is a navigation property for Entity Framework, and Entity Framework will also detect this ID property based on naming conventions. Now let's also add a DB set for the programming languages to our DB context. So I open up here the Friend Organizer DB context. Below the friends property, I create another property of type DB set for programming languages. I call the property programming languages. Now we can already use the DB context to load programming languages from the database. But so far our database doesn't contain any programming languages. Let's also seed some popular programming languages to our database. So I go to our migrations, and in the migrations you might remember we have that configuration class. In that configuration class we have the seedings for our friends. So below the friends, I do a seeding for programming languages. You can see I just used the name as an identifier and I add some languages to the database. Now let's save everything and let's open up the Package Manager console. I select the Data Access project and now I use the add migration command. I call the migration edit programming language. I hit enter and now a DB migration is created in our migrations folder. As you can see, a programming language table will be created. The primary key is the ID based on Entity Framework's naming conventions, and the name column will not be nullable and it will have a max length of 50. exactly how we specified it with the data annotations. On the friend table, we will get an additional column called favorite language ID. Beside an index, a foreign key is created for that column that points to the programming language table. Now let's update the database by calling the update database command in the package manager console. Okay, the migration has been applied and the seed method was executed. So now when I open up the Server Explorer, I can open up the data connections and I can go to tables in my Friend Organizer database. I right click and I say refresh. And here we go, we have a new programming language table. When I right click the table, I can select show table data. And here we see the data that we have seeded from our configuration class here. So exactly these 5 programming languages. When I open up the table definition for the friend table, we can also see that we have a foreign key now for the favorite language ID column. When you look at the T-SQL code, you can also see that foreign key constraint here. This is just the name, and when I scroll to the right, we can see it's the favorite language ID column that references the ID column of the programming language table. So far we have set up this new programming language entity, we have added a seeding and a migration, and now we can continue to use it in the lookup data service. In this demonstration you learn how you can extend the lookup data service to load programming languages. Then we will load the programming languages lookup by using the lookup data service in the friend detail view model. Now let's start with the lookup data service. In the UI project of the Friend Organizer application, we have this lookup data service class. We use it already to load a friend lookup for the navigation. As you might remember, this method returns lookup items, and a lookup item on its own just has an ID and a display member property. Now we need to do exactly the same for the programming languages. To make it simple, I just copy this whole method and I adjust it. Let's first change the name to getProgrammingLanguageLookupAsync. Now inside of the method we create the context and we want to use the programming languages DB set. For each programming language we create a new lookup item. And from the programming language we just need to use the name property for the display member. Now I save this and I place the cursor behind the class and I press Ctrl- to extract an interface. I want to extract the interface iProgrammingLanguageLookupDataService. And the interface should just contain the method getProgrammingLanguageLookupAsync. I click OK to generate that interface. Now you might think we need to register it in the Bootstrapper. But we were really smart in the previous modules because we registered the lookup data service as implemented interfaces. So when we look at the Bootstrapper, we can see here the lookup data service and it is registered as implemented interfaces. So our new iProgrammingLanguageLookupDataService interface will automatically use that lookup data service implementation. Now we can extend the friend detail view model. In the previous clip we have created this iProgrammingLanguageLookupDataService interface. Now we can use it in the friend detail view model to load our programming languages. So let's open up the friend detail view model. In the friend detail view model, I add a constructor parameter of type iProgrammingLanguageLookupDataService. I press Ctrl- to add a using for Friend Organizer UI data lookups. And I call the parameter ProgrammingLanguageLookupDataService. As I'm lazy, I just copy it from here. And I make the p a lowercase p. Now I copy the name of the parameter and I write here an underscore and I paste it equals and I paste it again. I press Ctrl- to generate the field underscore programming language lookup data service. So now we have the lookup data service to load the programming languages, but somewhere we need to store them. So let's initialize here a new property that we call programming languages. And we just initialize it with a new observable collection of lookup items. I press Ctrl- to add a using for System Collections object model, and I press Ctrl- again to generate the programming languages property. Now let's collapse our class to definitions. So I go to Edit, Outlining, and I say Collapse to Definitions. Or you can use the shortcut here Ctrl-M-O. Now here you can see our new property, Programming Languages. We don't need that private setter here as we initialize this property with a new observable collection in the constructor. Now we need to fill that observable collection with programming languages, and we can do this in the loadAsync method. So here, after we have done the initialization of the friend, we just load our programming languages by using the lookup data service. First I access our programming languages observable collection and I clear it, in case if this loadAsync method has been called twice. Then I use the programming language lookup data service and I call the getProgrammingLanguageLookupAsync method. I store the results in a lookup variable and I use the await keyword here. Now as we have the lookup, we just need to add the items to the programming languages observable collection. So let's use a for each loop here and let's say for each lookup item in that lookup, and we want to add each lookup item to the programming languages observable collection. Now we are done in this view model. But when you look at this loadAsync method, it's a bit big. So let's refactor it a bit into separate methods. Let's select the logic here to fill the programming languages lookup. Now I can press Ctrl- to extract a method. I call the method loadProgrammingLanguagesLookupAsync. Now let's look at the rest of the method. Here in the first statement, we just decide if we have to load a friend by using the friend repository or if we have to create a new friend. After we have that friend instance, we wrap it here in a friend wrapper. Then we set up a property changed event handler on the friend wrapper and we also trigger the validation with our little trick. So actually, all this logic around the friend wrapper can be extracted into a separate method. So I select this code here, I press Ctrl- to extract a method and I call it initializeFriend. And now I think you agree, our loadAsync method looks now much cleaner than before. Now our friend detail view model is done. The next step is to use this programming languages property in the friend detail view so that the user can select a favorite programming language for a friend.